In this video, we're going to look at the graphs of sine and cosine functions and talk about amplitude of sine and cosine. First, let's take a look at graphs of sine and cosine using our graphing calculator. So let's make sure that our mode is in radian. And then you want to graph sine of x. So let's graph it. Now the graph looks too flat, so whenever you want to graph trig functions, go to zoom and then press number 7 for zoom trig. And you'll have a better graph of sine x. Now, when you go to window, you will notice that x minimum is negative 0.63, x max 8 everything's in decimals. That's because, let's say you want to go from negative 2 pi to 2 pi. And you see how everything changes in decimals? And then x scale, I'm going to make it as pi over 2. Okay, let's leave the y minimum to negative 2 and y max to 2 and y scale is 1. So let's graph this. So now we're going from negative 2 pi to 2 pi, and each scale, x scale is pi over 2. So this is 0, that's pi over 2, that's pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi, and so forth. And each y scale is 1. So this is 1, that's 2, that's negative 1, and negative 2. And notice, when you look at the graph of sine x, you start from 0, and then you go all the way up to 1, you come back down to 0, and you go down to negative 1, and then you go back to 0. And we call this one cycle because this cycle repeats. So when you want to graph sine x without using a graphing calculator, you want to start from 0. Because sine of 0 is 0. And then you go pi over 2. Sine of pi over 2 is 1. And then sine of pi is 0. And sine of 3 pi over 2 is going to be negative 1. And then sine of 2 pi is going to be 0. So the graph of sine x will look like this. It's going to be a smooth curve. And this is a one cycle. You know that the sine will go continuously to the right and to the left. So that's how you would graph sine x without the graphing calculator. Now let's take a look at the graph of cosine x. So I'm going to deselect sine x, and as my y2, I'm going to graph cosine x. I'm going to leave the window as it was, so let's graph cosine x. And now look at cosine x. When x equals 0, cosine of 0 is 1. And when x equals pi over 2, cosine of pi over 2 is 0, and so forth. Again, this is a one cycle, because this cycle right here repeats. So if you want to graph cosine x without the graphing calculator, you want to start from 0, and it's going to be 1, 0, 1. And then at pi over 2, it's going to be 0. And at pi is going to be negative 1. And at 3 pi over 2, cosine of 3 pi over 2 is 0. And cosine of 2 pi is going to be 1 again. Now you need to draw a smooth curve. And you know that cosine x also is continuous. So this is how you would graph y equals cosine x. And notice for x values, we are using radian instead of degree. We'll be talking about sinusoidal functions. Sinusoidal functions are functions that look like these two. And depending on what A, B, C, and D are, it will transform the graphs. And we'll look at each one of these four values and see how it changes the graph of sine and cosine. Now let's take a look at the amplitude of a sinusoidal function. Amplitude is the half the distance between the maximum and minimum values of the function, or half of the height of the wave. So if we have a wave, the height of the wave is from the bottom to the top. And amplitude is just half of the height. So if you want to find the amplitude, just start from the middle, go all the way up, or go all the way down. It's the half the distance from between the maximum and minimum. That's the amplitude. And the amplitude is absolute value of A. And we'll look at more examples. Let's take a look at these two graphs. We have sine of x and 2 sine of x. Here the amplitude is 1 because the absolute value of 1 is 1. And here the amplitude is 2 because the absolute value of 2 is 2. And let's take a look at these two graphs. So the blue line is sine x. And the red line is sine of 2x. Notice, they look similar, it's just that sine 2x now, it goes all the way up to 2. And it goes all the way down to 2. See how the amplitude changed? The graph of sine x compared to sine of 2x. Now let's compare sine x with negative sine x. Here the amplitude is 1 because the absolute value of 1 is positive 1. Here, what is A? A is negative 1. However, the amplitude is going to be 1 also because the absolute value of negative 1 is 1. And let's see how these two graphs look like. So the blue is the sine x and the red line is negative sine x. They look exactly alike, it's just that negative sine x is a reflection of sine x with respect to the x-axis. So if you want to graph negative sine x, what you need to do is you start from 0. However, instead of going up, you need to go down and come back up. But they both have the same amplitude. Let's try to graph this without the help of graphing calculator. So what is A? A is 1 over 4. And what's going to be the amplitude? Well, the amplitude is the absolute value of 1 over 4. So amplitude will be 1 over 4. That's the amplitude. Now, if you want to graph 1 over 4 sine of x, you probably want to start graphing sine of x. So here's 0, 0, 0. Pi over 2, you go all the way up to 1. Here's pi, 0, 3 pi, you go down to negative 1, and then 2 pi. Sine of 2 pi is 0. So you would probably want to draw a dotted line. and that is sine of x. Now, how are you going to graph 1/4 of sine x? Well, the amplitude is going to be 1/4. The highest it's going to go up is 1/4. 1/4. And the lowest is going to go down to is negative 1/4. So again, sine of 0 is 0. And 0 times 1/4 is 0. And then you go all the way up to 1/4. And you come back to pi. And then you go down to negative 1/4. And then 0. So this graph right here is g of x equals 1/4 sine of x. Now, of course, the graph continues, but we just wanted to graph one cycle. And graphing one cycle is good enough. Now, what if you want to graph negative 2 cosine x? What is a? A is negative 2. And what is absolute value of a, which is absolute value of negative 2? That's going to be 2. So in this case, amplitude is 2. And how are we going to graph this? Well, in order to graph this, we want to sketch cosine x first. So here's 1. Here's negative 1. Here's 0. This is pi over 2. Pi. 3 pi over 2 and 2 pi. So in order to graph cosine x, you want to start from 1. And then you go down to pi over 2. And then negative 1 at pi. Pi and negative 1. And then 0 over here. And then back to 1. So I'm going to use a dotted line. This is a graph of cosine x. Okay, again, I drew only one cycle. Now, how are you going to graph g of x equals negative 2 cosine x? Well, the amplitude is going to be 2, right? So you have to go, it's going to go all the way up to 2 and all the way down to negative 2. But now be careful. This is negative 2 cosine x. So instead of starting from 2, we have to start from negative 2. Because this is, a is negative. And then you come back to 0. Just think about it. What's cosine of pi over 2? Cosine of pi over 2 is 0. 0 times negative 2 is 0. But cosine of 0 is 1. 1 times negative 2 is negative 2. So that's why when it's 0, you started from negative 2. And when it's pi, you have to go back up to 2. When it's 3 pi over 2, it's going to be 0. And when it's 2 pi, it's going to be negative 2. So it's going to look like this. So in a way, if you want to graph negative 2 cosine x, you probably want to graph 2 cosine x first, and then flip it over respect to the x-axis. That might be another way. So this is a graph of negative 2 cosine x.